Okay, there we go. Now I'm recording it. So yeah, starting with communism. Communism is one of the more off the wall, far left field, ideologies that we're looking at during this period. There's never really been, contrary to popular belief, there's really never been a communist country or a communist revolution uh, like the one Marx is describing in the book. Um, he's envisioning kind of a global revolution of the working class where everybody is equal. Everybody provides to the community what they can, and they get from the community what they need. It's one of Marx's famous lines. But communism doesn't really work that well on the level that Marx is talking about. The Soviet Union was it lasted many decades. We still have communist China, but they're really not that communist anymore. They're very much a market economy and mixed with an authoritarian regime. I guess we still have Cuba, but there's not really been any kind of global revolution like the one Marx is describing. And so, I'm on the record right now saying communism might be a good idea in theory, but it never really works out the way that it's supposed to. But in 1848, Marx and Engels write this book, and they kind of foresee this communist revolution starting to germinate in the West, and eventually it's going to blossom into a full-scale revolution that sweeps the globe. And in fact, they predicted that the United States would be the first country to go communist, which is really funny. Obviously, that has not happened. So how do Marx and Engels view history? Like what is their kind of, how do they see the entire scope of history according to the Communist Manifesto?
Basically just the haves and the have-nots. Basically the rich keep getting richer and benefit off the poor, and that's been society since basically the beginning of time.
Yeah, it dates back, like all the way back to, when chieftains found out, or early pharaohs or kings found out that they could just dominate, by claiming to be gods or something, gods on earth. They could just dominate their communities. The feudal era, I guess I'm kind of answering the second question here that I asked, but the feudal period where like lords would own all the land in a kingdom and make the peasants work the land. All the way up to the Industrial Revolution, where now it's the capitalists are now the masters and commanders of society, and everyone has to work for pennies on the hour. So yeah, this is called a dialectical view of history. It's a class war is what is happening according to Marx and Engels. Do you guys agree with I'm not, you don't have to give away your political leanings here. Like, I'm not asking if you're communist, but this Marxist view of looking at history as a battle between the haves and the have-nots, do you think there's anything to that, or is he just kind of blowing smoke here?
100% accurate.
TJ's like, yeah. Okay. Because of the reasons he mentions, or like, what? Explain your reasoning here.
I think, you can look at today just as much as anywhere else in history. I think the rich have always used their money and their influence to keep the poor down by not allowing them to gain access to education or anything that will allow them to get to the same level.
Okay. So there is this common thread of the haves kind of controlling things, and what's more, you kind of view this as like a control mechanism that they're trying to exploit people.
I think sometimes that's on purpose. Sometimes it's just, kind of like we talked about in the last chapter with the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
They were working, 16 hours a day and sleeping the other 8. When are they going to learn that they're being oppressed or organize against the oppression or do anything to stop it? They're stuck.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, TJ. No, I think that's valid. Anybody else have any thoughts on this? Like, is this valid?
Did didn't one of them encourage violence toward the rich?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's implied definitely in the Communist Manifesto that there's going to be a violent revolution. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, which I mean, yeah. The Marx and Engels are claiming that there's been violence done to the working class or to the proletariat for millennia, and therefore that violence is justified in being turned around on their capitalist masters, or whatever. Yeah, and this is an ongoing thing. There definitely are still Marxists around today. There are a lot of people, particularly in academia. So like I went to Purdue, for instance. I had a Marxist professor for one of my classes, and she was like, the way I see history, it's a battle between the haves and the have-nots. She's like, I think Marx is right. Now, that was a minority view at Purdue. I only had the one professor who believed in that out of the dozens, that I had to go through. But, Marxism is still around as an idea because in theory, it kind of makes sense. If you look at the wealth gap in the whole world, if you look at the wealth gap in the United States in any time period, it's getting bigger, between people who have most of the money or capital or wealth and people who, have to work for a wage, But at the same time, capitalism itself kind of contradicts this idea. This is bear with me for just a second, because capitalism doesn't believe in a zero-sum game. Capitalism believes in the more opportunity that you give to more people, the bigger the pie, the share of wealth increases for everybody to try and get a slice. Now, it doesn't work out this way all the time. But, if we look at human history, I don't know, over the last 100 years, the working class is objectively better off than it was 100 years ago. It's better off than it was 60, 70 years ago. You could argue in some ways we're better off today than we were 20 years ago. You could also argue that we're not. Wages have stagnated. But so there's a few different ways to look at it. And capitalism itself is more complicated than Marx is portraying in the Communist Manifesto. Because the nature of global capitalism is so complicated, it does provide more opportunities for more people, even though, yes, it does oppress and exploit some as well. So I've got that on record now. That's in my deposition. That's going to be in the discovery phase of my trial when I get dragged before the Ministry of Truth. I am not endorsing communism. It has problems. But the Marxist view of history does kind of make sense if you look at it from a certain point of view. So TJ, I think you're right. Logan brings up a good point. So there's this battle between the two classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The thing I just want to point out here with this question is the bourgeois takes many different forms over history, according to Marx. They might look like a king or a pharaoh. They might look like a landlord. They might look like a factory owner, just depending on what period of history you're in. So how does the bourgeois, this ruling class, according to Marxism, how do they grow and maintain their power? What kinds of mechanisms of control do they place over the working people?
Propaganda.
Oh, good. Propaganda. That's not where my mind went first, but that's absolutely valid. What kinds of propaganda do we see in the modern world to keep us from all rising up and seizing the means of production?
You could argue that the American dream is propaganda.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. I really like that.
That's absolutely right. Absolutely right. Yes, this idea that anyone can achieve their dreams if they just work hard enough, and you can achieve, you can own your own home, have 2.5 kids, the white picket fence, and the 2 cars in a garage.
How do you have 2.5 kids? Because that doesn't sound like it would work.
Well, communism, right? So we have to split some kids to share the wealth. No, I'm kidding. That's a terrible joke. No, it's a statistical thing from like the 50s where most households had an average of 2.5. It's not, not a wisdom of Solomon thing or anything here. We're not splitting babies. So the American dream is this idea, and it's worked for a lot of people, right? A lot of people have achieved that. A lot of people have not. And that, I'm sure, causes some enmity among people who were like, hey, I thought, not that I was entitled to something, but why the hell, how is it fair that, these people over here are able to get what they want and live in comfort while my wages haven't gone up since the 1990s and healthcare keeps getting more expensive and I just can't get ahead, What other forms of propaganda, while we're on the topic, do we see?
You could argue again that like the whole voting movement is a form of propaganda, like your voice matters. You could argue that today, especially in Illinois, if you vote red, your voice isn't going to matter in the presidential election.
Good. Yeah. Marx would say democracy is a sham, partly because of this reason. Obviously, the two-party system in the United States is very problematic in lots of different ways. And if Marx were around today, he'd point to that and be like, yep, that's a mechanism of control. It's always going to be a Democrat or Republican elected to any office like ever. And that's how they keep you down, man. And your vote doesn't matter, especially, if you're not in a swing state. Good. I'm thinking one thing that I thought of too is like advertisement, right? Like commercials, ads, driving you to consume, driving you to always strive to have the next newest iPhone or whatever, I listen to a lot of podcasts and like it's always MeUndies or it's always ZipRecruiter or it's always, you know what I mean? And you're just like, no matter what, like no matter where you go, you can disappear into your own little world and you still have advertisements bombarding you constantly, telling you that capitalism is normal and it's okay and it's good. And Marx would be like, no, it's brainwashing. These advertisements are brainwashing. So good. So just in the realm of propaganda by itself, I mean, that's a lot. There's a lot of mechanisms of control there. Yeah, Logan.
Would fear be one?
Yeah, fear. So how would fear be a mechanism of control?
Like for people running for office, like trying to dissuade people from choosing their political opposition.
Rabble rousing.
Yeah. Rabble rousing. There's a political science term for this called demagoguery. If you're a demagogue, you play on the fears of people to get them to vote for you and to not vote for the other guy. Immigrants are gonna come take our jobs or whatever it is. This is another mechanism of control. Very good. Now part of this is just outside of the realm of, like, a lot of the stuff has been around before Marx and a lot of it has been around regardless of Marx's views, but still Marx kind of tries to synthesize these mechanisms of control and frame history as like it's the haves using all these mechanisms to control you, the working class. And if you just open your eyes, wake up, sheeple, you'll be able to rise up and change the world, and you don't have to be controlled anymore. And whether you think that's bunk or not is totally fine. I'm just trying to present Marx here in a historical context. So what is the solution here? And I think Logan's already gestured toward this a little bit. What's the solution to breaking out of this hellscape of thousands of years of human slavery by the bourgeois? What do we do about it?
Eat the rich.
Yeah, that's a very common I don't know, millennial phrase now, eat the rich. Yeah. Get
Go
your,
Robin Hood.
what's that?
Go Robin Hood.
Go Robin Hood. Yeah. Yeah, take from the rich.
Well, it's not like there is an easy solution, or else someone who's a lot smarter than all of us would have probably found it a while ago.
Yeah.
I mean, there's always going to be a working class, a poor class. It's just, I think the solution is finding the most fair. I don't know. I kind of trailed off, but finding the most fair way for there still to be poor people, but they're not unlivable.
Yeah.
There's a difference between poor and
Destitute.
Yeah.
Yeah. And which raises a really good point, TJ. Like, so does anyone, and I don't want to get too political here, but remember the Democratic primaries that happened like a million years ago in the spring? And in the summer, I guess. Andrew Yang was one of the contenders for the Democratic primary, and his whole idea, he lost. Obviously, he's not on the ticket, but his whole idea that he tried to advance is a fairly new idea called universal basic income.
Mm.
Where has anyone heard of this? Am I just?
I've heard of it.
Okay.
I mean, yeah.
I haven't really looked a whole lot into it. It doesn't sound very viable to me.
Right.
Just
Yeah.
off the bat.
It's probably not, especially for a country the size of ours with 330 million people.
It just sounds like asking for a lot of inflation.
Yeah. But the idea is to give someone, like basically everyone, just by virtue of being a citizen of the United States, gets a fixed amount of money from the government every month. And you do whatever you want with that money. You invest it, you spend it, you save it, whatever. But it's yours and you're entitled to it. And it's a way of, the idea is, it's a way of providing this fairness that you're talking about, like trying to work with it, like not abolishing capitalism, but working within the system that we have to try and raise up the poorest people and make them, like you say, they'll still be, they're still not going to have as much as the richest people, but they won't be destitute, So it's interesting that there's still, like, even today in 2020, there's a lot of ideas still floating around about how do we fix this? Like, because you're right, there's always going to be.
I still think that sounds like just printing more money,
Oh yeah, I'm not saying there's no problems with it. But yeah, because you're right. Like, it would blow up the monetary system overnight if we, like, there's a lot of issues with that. But it's trying to get at this idea of, like, how do we make things more fair, or at least how do we, we're this is the richest the West has ever been in human history. We are the richest country the world has ever seen in human history. And yet we still have people living on the streets and children without, stable meals. Like there's a lot of kids living in scarcity. How do we fix it?
I think we need to somehow find, obviously we still have to have capitalism, free market, but I think we need to have some kind of regulation that makes the trickle-down effect happen. Because right now, the trickle-down effect just doesn't happen. It all stays at the top.
Right.
And there needs to be some way for the top to, kind of open the floodgates and let everything fall down where it belongs. Now, how we do that is obviously more difficult than just pointing out what the problem is.
Yeah, it is. It's tricky.
Kind of like the difference between Wall Street and the Bronx. They're basically neighbors, and they're very different in terms of power, you could say.
Yeah, and we live in a world where that's normalized. Like, that's okay. Like, no one really thinks anything of it. And if someone wanted to get ahead in the Bronx, like they should just get an education and pull themselves up by their bootstraps and go and get a job and work their way up. That's the American dream, right? Telling you that it's your fault if you're not successful. And what I'm trying to say here is like Marx and Engels would just say the whole system is rotten. Like we can do better than this. And I don't know if we can't. Like I'm not saying one way or the other, you know. But there's a lot of ideas floating around during this time, and still today in 2020. Like, you know, how do we try and do right by the blessings of that the modern world has given us? You know, how do we do right by the most people? So it's not an accident that this ideology comes about as a result of the Industrial Revolution and the crazy inequality that happened then. It's no accident that people are talking more and more about socialism today in 2020 as inequality continues to grow. So yeah, these are all, I think, natural outgrowths of we see problems, we're trying to solve those problems. That's basically what it boils down to. All right, good stuff. So then the next document talks about gender. This is my first time reading this document, to be honest, when I assigned it. I've never read Sarah Ellis before, and I was a little shocked to read it. So what are women doing wrong? What are middle class women doing wrong according to this document?
I could be wrong here, but are they buying into this idea that work is a good thing, or that working excessively is like a benefit, that you want to be more like your male counterpart?
Okay, maybe a little bit. Yeah, she does address that there's like kind of a falling away of gender roles. And she argues that like we need to have a strict separation of like men's work and women's work. And if those two things kind of, if you blur the lines, then you start to get all kinds of problems in society. Women acting more manly and men acting more effeminate. And we can't have that. That goes against the laws of nature. So there's a little bit of that in there. She looks at the working class, which, by the way, there's a lot of women working in factories at the time because they have to, because they need to survive. And Sarah Ellis kind of looks down her nose at these women working, and she's like, you know, you should be staying in the home, raising kids, making babies. That should be your job. Not working alongside men. So yeah, the other thing too is on the other side of the spectrum, middle class women are trying to imitate the lifestyle of their social betters, the aristocracy, the richie riches. They're hiring like nannies. They are
wet nurses.
They're hiring help, and that's shameful because a good, solid middle-class woman should be doing the work of the household herself, not hiring someone else to do it for her. And according to Sarah Ellis, this is the root of all social evil. Like this is, you know, the gender roles are falling apart, and women are shirking their duties, basically. So, I mean, we don't have to spend too long on this document, but it's this kind of, there's no such thing as feminism yet in the mid 1800s. Like no one's really coined that term yet, but there's an increasing agitation among women that like, hey, we're here, we're 50% of the population. Why don't we get any decision-making power in society? Like, why can't we vote? Why can't we own property? Why can't we divorce when we want to? Why is it always the man who does these things and not women? So there's this rising idea that like women should be involved in decision making in society. And Sarah Ellis is here to say no. Like, no. That would ruin everything. There's a natural order to gender. And if you start to mess with it, either by sending women into the factories or by women being too lazy and hiring nannies and wet nurses, then we see the collapse of society as we know it. You know, we see the downfall of civilization. So she's urging, Alice is urging her fellow females to work hard to educate the kids to stay in the house. And let men do it, because let men do everything else. That's their job, right? Why do you think this would happen? Why would you see like this kind of anti-feminist middle-class woman railing against women's rights? Why? Any ideas? I know it's not super obvious from the document, but like, do you have any ideas why this would be the case?
Tradition. I mean, that's the only thing I can think of. Like, oh, that's the way my parents, grandparents did it. That's the way of life.
Yeah, I was going to say just cultural brainwashing.
That's the more cynical way of looking at it, but I like it. Yeah. Tradition, cultural norms, cultural pressure. So on Tuesday, I tried to make the point that the world is changing very quickly at this point. Like in the early to mid 1800s, the world is changing so fast. The French Revolution has thrown politics into disarray. All of a sudden, people are looking at their kings thinking, you know, we could cut his head off if we wanted to, because it's happened before. The economy is changing because of industrialism. The Enlightenment has changed people's ideas about learning and all this stuff, rights, natural rights. And so what people are looking for in spades in this period of chaos and change is some kind of stability. Like, where do we hang our hat? What can we count on as being true at the end of the day? And you're absolutely right. Tradition. Like, people are very, very resistant to change when it comes to getting rid of, you know, what their dads and moms did and grandmas and grandpas did. And from time immemorial, you know, things like gender roles have been a fact of life, non-negotiable. And all of a sudden, that's thrown up in the air because of all this other change. So people are desperate. People like Sarah Ellis are desperate to cling on to some kind of tradition, to just be a rock in a storm, you know, and just to be some kind of stability in times of great change. That's basically it. So we'll talk more about feminism and kind of women's rights as we go on, but this is the first kind of like someone planting their flag and being like, no, women's rights are bad because it's more change, and change is scary. So, yeah, all right. Well, guys, we did it. That's a good half hour, I think, of dissecting these two documents. And you'll have quite a bit to draw on then for the analysis paper next week. For this week, you just have your quiz to do. If you haven't done it, just do it by the end of today and you're good to go. Any questions or anything else? Any rallying cries for the proletariat to overthrow?
I mean, if we just all follow the words of the famous Communist Manifesto song, imagined by John Lennon, we get rid of the countries, we get rid of religion, and everything's going to be okay.
Yeah.
That's why the CIA assassinated him, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Finally, some actual history is being said.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, this guy's got it. He's figured it out. All right. Well, obviously, I haven't brainwashed you guys enough to turn you into true Marxist, communist, socialist atheists. So I'll keep working on that. But in the meantime, I hope you guys have a good weekend. And thanks for a great morning. I'll see you later.
You too. Have a good weekend.
You too.
Have a good weekend.
See you guys.